Hey guys, thanks for sticking around again. Even though the semester is over, I know I didn't have a lot of time last week on week 16 because I just went way too long into the research I did on the Mormon question in England. So I wanted to do the video today about my research project I did in my Islam class. So this was understanding the challenges that are being faced by within Islam about modernizing the Quran for a more modern interpretation, basically. Some people in Islam want the Quran to be seen as a valuable document for our day and age. Some don't. This is a challenge inside Islam that's going on. A lot of it comes down to fundamentalists say we don't want to modernize the Qurans. We want to keep it very traditional, which is why a lot of Islamic countries that we see on the news all the time seem like they're behind the times because they're preferring a more traditional way to think about their society because they want a traditional fundamental principles of Islam. There are others who are more progressive in Islam and they would like to modernize it and have it be something that fits better for today's world. So there's this clash in there. So that's what I investigated and understood is what are some of the challenges to this? I found there are four major challenges to the modernization of Quranic texts. The first one that I came across is that the Quran, because Islam sees the Quran as the literal word of God. By reading it, it's as if you are talking with God himself, with Allah. Because these are revelations, the Quran are a series of revelations that were given to the Prophet Muhammad. And so they're the words of God that God spoke to Muhammad. They were written down, and so they're in effect God's words, which is why desecrating a Quran, leaving it on the ground, getting it dirty is like desecrating the word of God. We take care of it. We show great respect for this book because it is almost, in a way, it's a piece of God to an extent. So I wish we could treat our scriptures that way and not kick them around or let them get dog-eared and problematic and stuff. They honor and respect the book because they see it as a piece of God. I think Christianity has a lot to learn in that aspect about sacred texts. But the problem is because the Quran is seen as a piece of God, they have not historically allowed the Quran to be interpreted and critically investigated or evaluated through scholarship. So part of this comes down to the idea that, well, if this is the word of God, why are we trying to evaluate it through the perspective of a bunch of mortals who are not God? God is perfect, therefore his word is perfect. We don't need to evaluate it or do any critical research or studies on it at all. So the Quran has not been readily available for most of Islamic history to be investigated and read and discussed and evaluated. Like the Bible has research on it going back for centuries, but there's not that much in the Quran. There has been more in today's world with how much scholarship there is out there anyways today, that there is scholarship happening, but they're not trying to allow a lot of that to be officially recognized as an opportunity to interpret the Quran. The other problem that happens with this, and this kind of ties in with the second reason, is this whole idea of Western scholarship. Western scholarship is seen as trying to westernize Islam. And so because the Islam doesn't like the West, they think the West is evil and bad and wrong and sinful, why do we want them to evaluate our book? So modernization of the Quranic texts to a lot of fundamentalists in Islam come across as we're giving our sacred text to the enemy and then hoping they give us a good report back. We just think they're just going to skew it and they're going to destroy it and make it hard for people to believe in the Quran. We're not going to do that. So that's why they've been holding back the Quran. Now, because of how much scholarship there is out there in the world today, they kind of can't stop it from happening, but they're preventing it from being accepted as official interpretations. So the Quran, the Islam, has a governing body of scholars that study the Quran and the Hadith, which is a book about the life of Muhammad and how he applied the teachings in the Quran in his life, they evaluate this stuff and then they come out with what's known as a fatwa, which is a religious decree about how to apply this to people's lives. So they have their own internal scholarship on it. They're not really encouraging external scholarship on it. And part of that's because they think the Westerners are evil. The other part is Westerners have done scholarship. In the past, this is known as Orientalism. And most of it came out to make Islam look bad. It wasn't 100% correct. They're like, well, the scholarship you've already done doesn't look good for us. Why would we let you do more? So that's part of these challenges that are going into the modernization of Quranic texts. The third reason comes down to the Hadith. Now, the Hadith is a collection of stories about sayings and doings of the Prophet Muhammad. A lot of research on the Quran and the Hadith have discovered, I read this in several reports, that if you interpret the Quran through the lens of the Hadith, that you will end up with a more traditional, like 7th century interpretation of these writings. So that the Hadith encourages a more traditional approach to interpreting the Quran. So the scholars who believe the Quran can be a universal book, a book that can be applied today, they look at the Quran without the Hadith. They just take the Quran as its own text and look at it and then interpret it through a more modern lens. And that's how they say it can be a modern book. So getting rid of the Hadith, putting that aside, can help. There's lots of different Hadith stories out there, some good, some bad. A lot of different scholars will just pick and choose which one they want to have followed, and then they talk about that one and ignore the rest. A little bit of cherry picking sometimes happens, but Christianity does that too. In the Bible, you cherry pick verses to validate your opinion rather than demonstrate that it's really there, like the rapture. The rapture is a cherry picked idea. The concept of the rapture didn't even start till the 1800s. But most Christians will tell you the rapture is in the Bible because it talks about it in like Matthew and like 2nd Thessalonians or something like that. I don't remember off the top of my head, but they're like, these scriptures prove the rapture is there. The problem is those scriptures were written like several centuries before they even knew the concept of the rapture. There's no texts that talk about the concept of the rapture around the time when the Bible was compiled and put together into what we think of it today. So the rapture is an idea that came by many hundreds of years after the Bible is put together. So you can't. Seeing the rapture in it is reading your interpretation into the book, and that's like what the Hadith does. And so they say if you get rid of the Hadith and just address the Quran as its own, you can see it in a more modern way. Now, the fourth reason that this is such a challenge is a lot of Islamic governments gain a lot of power from the interpretation into the Quran that they allow. So they want an interpretation that encourages the power structures that will keep them in power. So if you come out with an interpretation of the Quran that challenges the traditional power dynamics in Islam, they don't want it. So if you can't support their cause, they don't want to hear it, basically. So that's a major problem, because if the political favor is not there for your interpretation, nobody's going to listen to you, because the government's going to tell everybody it's a wrong interpretation, don't listen to him. So those are big challenges, big challenges that we face. Let's talk about now, so those are like the high level, in general, big challenges. So let's talk about what are some ways to interpret the Quran. One way is through what's known as the empirical method. An empirical method of understanding the Quran is corroborating Quran teachings with scientific discovery. So can we run tests and experiments? Can we do things in science to help us understand the Quran better? This is a big area of discussion, probably one of the more larger areas historically, because science is agnostic. You do an experiment, you're not looking for God in the experiment, you're just looking for the experiment and the results. Oftentimes, though, the interpretation of the results of the experiment are usually ran through a religious filter. Oh, this happened this way because God wanted it this way, type of thing. So this happens in Quran. Now, in between the 8th and the 14th centuries, Islam was one of the more prolific religions, organizations that were encouraging scientific discovery. They learned from everybody else. They learned from the Greeks, they learned from the Romans, the Egyptians, and everybody else. And they took all their wisdom and pulled it together. And then they furthered scientific discoveries. They did a lot. Like there's actually a lot. If you go back through and look at like the history of science, you'll eventually run into a bunch of Arabic names. That's because that was when Islam was leading the world in scientific discovery and scientific research. So it's a little ironic that the empirical approach is not being encouraged in our modern age. Most of the reason it's not being encouraged is because over the last couple hundred years, the predominant understanding of Islam has been a fundamentalist idea. And what I mean by fundamentalist ideas, I mean they want to go back to the roots. How was the Quran interpreted around the 7th and 8th centuries? That's how it still should be interpreted today. That's why places like Iran, Afghanistan, all these other places that we hear about in the news that are very Islamic, the nation is a predominantly Islamic. They kind of, from a Western perspective, it seems like they're backwards. It seems like they're living in the past, but it's because they're using a fundamentalist interpretation of their religion. And so that's a big part of it, basically. So that's the challenge, okay, is so because the fundamentalists don't want the science. So they've kind of suppressed and pushed away that part of their own history, which is making it hard to modernize their religion. So there was a book written by a French doctor, Maurice Bousset, and I found a couple quotes from him I put in my research paper. So he quoted a couple of verses out of the Quran and then showed in his book how those verses match up with what scientific discovery sees around the creation. So the creation story is a common one for people to try to match science with the creation story to prove a scriptural text to be true. So he did this. Dr. Bousset did this in his book, pulled a bunch of things. Oh yeah, here's what science says, and here's what the Quran said, and it corroborates, basically. Some scholars who really love this kind of work have used this in arguments to show, the Quran is talking about things that scientists only recently have discovered. So if the Quran is talking about things that scientists only recently discovered, then the Quran is talking about things that did not exist, or they didn't even know back when it originated, when the Quran was first written. Therefore, the Quran is true as a prophetic revelatory book. So they use these connections between science, our scientific understanding, and Quran interpretations to prove that the Quran is a revelatory, true book of God. Because what human would have known about how about solar systems form? There's a big ball of gas, a nebula, and then the gases coalesce and they start to form matter, and you get gravity forming, and more stuff comes together and it forms planets. They kind of divide amongst themselves and things. And they're looking at the Quran going, well, we know that science says this is how the earth formed and how the universe came together. And they look at the Quran and go, oh, look, it's talking about God used smoke, pulled the earth out of smoke and divided it and stuff. And so they're mapping these two together, claiming that means the Quran was way ahead of its time. Therefore, it has to be a prophetic book, because only God would have known those things back then, not humans. And this happens even in Christianity, in Judaism, and others saying, oh, here's how we can prove our scriptures are great because they predict things, that they're truly prophetic books because they predict things and talk about stuff that didn't happen back then. It's an argument. I wouldn't say it's the best argument, but it is an argument that's being used. Not everybody agrees with this. Some Islamic scholars look at it and go, well, you could point out some correlations between science and religion in Islam, but we don't need these scientific discoveries to verify the Quran. The Quran is a religious book. It's focusing on man's relationship with God. It's not meant to be a universal knowledge book, basically, about everything. So that's part of the problem with these connections on the empirical approach. So let's talk about one more approach to interpreting the Bible, or not Bible, the Quran. And this is a very popular approach today, and it's called hermeneutics. So hermeneutics is a term that means looking at it from a different lens. So if you have a figure like a statue you're looking at, and you're looking at it from straight on, that's one perspective. And then if you turn 90 degrees and looked at it this way, that's a second perspective of the same item. So a hermeneutic would be, which position are you standing as you look at the statue? Or what color of lenses are you using to view the statue or the item? So hermeneutics is understanding that you're coming from a certain perspective in looking at this thing. So when it comes to Quranic teachings, most people would say that the predominant hermeneutic, so the predominant perspective of the Quran, is a male-centric patriarchal perspective. So what people today want is a feminine perspective of the Quran. Women aren't mentioned very much in the Quran at all. Sometimes they're sort of mentioned. Usually it's a we phrase, like Adam and his wife, when Adam's talking to God, he says, "We sinned, we're sorry." It's the like we, so you kind of have to read the woman into the stories. But there's a lot of women that are like, well, women have been around. Women were there when the Quran was formed, when Muhammad was alive. Women played larger roles in the history of Islam, but they're being pushed out and suppressed in today's world because of the fundamental philosophies. So the feminist approach is let's look at the Quran from a woman's perspective. What does this mean? What does this imply? How can this be thought of through a woman's perspective? And there's a couple of major problems in doing this. The two major problems with the feminist approach that I put in my article is this idea of feminism is one of them, okay? In the history of Quran, there is no concept of the idea of feminism. A feminine identity isn't something that's even talked about or discussed hardly at all within Quran in Islamic teachings. Women are a part of it. Women are there, but them having a voice, having an opinion separate than men is unheard of for the most part, especially in the fundamentalist ideas of Islam. So the whole idea of a feminine approach is a modern Western style of looking at the Quran. Again, it goes back to the idea of the Orientalism. We don't want the West telling us how to interpret our religion, because it's going to be biased against us. So a feminist approach is seen as a Western approach. Therefore, we don't want it. That's problem number one. That's a very fundamental problem. Problem number two is, if feminism, if women's perspective of the Quran have validity and can be effective, there's a natural assumption that comes along with that says that the male-centered patriarchal interpretation might not be 100% correct. So if the feminine perspective can show truth, then that is truth that was not there or found or discovered or used during the patriarchal hermeneutic approach, which means the patriarchal hermeneutic approach might not be 100% correct. Now, because the governments of Islamic nations are men, they don't want their power structures being deposed or threatened. So if women have validity, then they need to be allowed into government. They need to be allowed more freedom. Therefore, the government is wrong and doing things wrong. Therefore, the government needs to lose its power. The people in power need to be brought down. New government needs to be put in place. And they don't want any of that. And so there's no point in even getting into the feminist approach if it's going to cause a cripple of my power. So those are some of the fundamental problems that feminism is running into. It's not stopping the feminists from doing scholarly research, a feminist approach of the Quran. There's books you can read. There's articles out there about it that are really interesting to get into. They make some really interesting points about the Quran, but it's to get it widely accepted, to get it to be an official decree of Islam, is probably going to take centuries to happen, because Islam moves very, very slowly at change. And it's only going to come because the fundamentalist believers die off and more progressive believers start to emerge into the leadership positions in Islam. So that's what's going to happen. So the to bring this full circle, the main question of can we do an updated interpretation of the Quran? Unofficially, it's happening already. Officially, no, it's not going to be happening. There's so many just fundamental challenges that need to be dealt with first. Just the animosity between Islam and the West is a major underlying problem, and that ties into politics, geopolitical conflicts, and other things. So it's not going away, and so the modernization won't be the interpretation that's official won't be a modernized one for a very long time. So, and then society's going to have moved forward, and so we'll see if it modernizes to their age or modernizes to our age by then. We'll see. But that was the final report. Thank you for watching. Absolutely fun semester that I did. It was a great experience, a lot of great times. So let me talk about next semester. So next semester starts in the beginning of January, so right after the new year. I might still do some videos in between then over the holidays on some books I'm reading or other things like that, other research I'm working on. So I'll see if I can fit some of those in as well. But I want to talk about what I'm doing next semester. So next semester is the final semester actually for my bachelor's, my undergrad degree. I'll have that by the end of next semester. Woohoo! Yay! I'm applying right now for graduate school, so hopefully I will know sometime in January, because that's usually in January is when they do the evaluations and things. Sometime in January and February, I should hopefully hear and get in. So pray for me if you can, or whatever you do, so that I can get into grad school this time. But yeah, so that's moving forward. So next semester, I've got 3 classes again next semester. Next semester, I have an interfaith practicum class. So if you followed my previous videos, I've been working towards, while getting this degree in religious studies, I've been working towards an interfaith leadership certificate. So it's just kind of a bonus to the degree. It really looks nice on resumes when I'm trying to if I'm looking for opportunities to work with other religions or charities, nonprofits, other things like that as well in the religious communities. I have to finish a final practicum to get that certificate. And so that's going to be next semester. I'll do that practicum and get that done. I'll tell you about those ideas and things when we get into the semester and get those worked out. I have another class on the Mongol Empire. So I studied ancient China almost 2 summers ago. The first semester I did ancient China. Loved it. Absolutely fascinating summer 2024. Go watch those videos. It's the beginning of this playlist. It was awesome. I've now studied Islam. So I've studied Asia, the Middle East, now the Mongol Empire, and how they influence all these other ones. So I'm excited for that one. That's going to be like the completion of this trifecta of the Middle Eastern Asian nations of understanding some of their ancient history. So the Mongol Empire I'm going to study. That'll be fun. And then I have another class studying ancient civilization. So getting into like Sumerians and Akkadians and those groups. And that should be a lot of fun. I hear it's a lot of writing for that class, so I'm a little nervous for the class just because that means a lot of homework, a lot of studying, reading, writing papers and research and stuff. But I think it'll be good practice and good opportunities to refine my writing skills and improve myself as I'm preparing to go into grad school. So I'm up for the challenge, and hopefully I can make it and maintain my 4.0 status through classes. But we'll see how that semester goes. So if you have any questions about this semester, about the classes I've been taking or things like that, feel free to put in the comments and we'll continue the conversation then. But if not, we'll see you in the next video.